Just a fair warning that what I am about to say may sound a little jarring. But that is the nature of love, is it not? It has the power to jar us wide open. 10 pilgrims stood in a circle preparing to go on a hayride tour of Reverend's farm in Graham, North Carolina. We were waiting for Suzanne the farmer, and she arrived in a pickup truck, wearing old clothes and a well-worn baseball cap. And before telling us anything about the farm, she led us in an impromptu Bible study. And she said something I will never forget. She said, God has put it on my heart that we need to read Jesus' parables backwards. She said, we got the spiritual meaning of Jesus' stories, but we no longer understand the meaning of the social and agricultural practices he used from the first century world. And given the mess we've made of the earth, she said, we now need to read backwards to discover the practical and material meaning of the story, to truly understand what it has to offer us today. Now, talk about having your theology jarred wide open. Suzanne believes there is divine wisdom about agriculture and farming, not just our spiritual lives and the stories Jesus told about soil and seed and wheat and tares and sheep and fig trees and leaven and barns and banquets. But if we read Jesus' parables backwards to gain wisdom about how we should live on the land, we can also read Jesus' other parables that way as well to discover wisdom about other worldly things: money, labor, law, politics, and the marketplace. In stories about treasure, lost coins, talents, minas, rich fools, wise builders, unjust stewards, tenants, landowners, publicans, creditors, debtors, and unforgiving servants. The human mind, though, is adept at compartmentalizing, and Christians historically have become even more adept at separating the material from the spiritual. And yet in every parable there is spiritual and material meaning, and they are often the same. The overly spiritualized interpretations we've inherited reflect the dualism in ourselves that we bring to the text. We are what is backwards, alienated and divided from our true selves. So maybe by reading backwards, we can reintegrate our dualistic and binary lives by rematerializing the spiritual and re-embodying the soul and re-enfleshing the spirit to make us whole again. We must begin wrestling with the story of the woman at Simon's dinner party by reading the parable Jesus told there backwards. Two people were indebted to the same creditor by a difference of more than a year's worth of wages. And when they could not pay, Jesus said, the creditor canceled the debts for them both. Then Jesus said, now which of them will love him more? And the word Jesus used for love here was not storge or familial love or eros, romantic love, or phileo, the love of friendship, but agape, the word in Greek for the most noble, selfless, unconditional, steadfast, and divine love of God. In this parable, Jesus associated the highest form of divine love with the material forgiveness of monetary debt. Now I know it's tempting to imagine that Jesus was only using this parable as a metaphorical tool to make a point about the forgiveness of sins. But the concept of debt and sin had a lot in common in those days, more than we think. Forgiveness was both a material and a spiritual concept in the first century, just like sin. Many modern Christians no longer believe in sin. And those who do imagine it as something merely personal and spiritual. Individualizing the concept of sin leads us to make wild assumptions about what the word sinner meant in the Gospels. Take the woman in the story, for instance. We assume she was a woman of the night, when nothing could be further than the truth. She's never called a sex worker in the text, and Luke did not describe her in any of the standard Greek words for that occupation. She engaged in none of the activities first century escorts performed at parties, dancing, drinking, or playing music. No, this urban woman wasn't who we think she was. Yet her behavior was still quite scandalous and jarring. Scholar Joel Green explains letting her hair down in this setting would have been on par with appearing topless in public. And she would have been perceived to have been fondling Jesus' feet. But Charles Cosgrove claims that while uncommon, letting one's hair down had a broad range of meanings in the Greco-Roman world, not just as a sexual advance, but also as a sign of grief, conjury, or devotion to a god or goddess. The woman's behavior must not have been inherently objectionable, or Simon would not have needed to suggest that Jesus was lacking insight into her background. It would have been obvious. So all we can safely say about this urban woman is that her gestures were highly ambiguous and would have been interpreted scandalously. But Jesus turned the tables when he reframed the woman's actions as a gesture of generous hospitality, great love, and saving faith. Jesus saved the woman from disgrace by comparing her with Simon, the host, and by showing Simon the Pharisee that because of this woman's incredible display of love, she had now become the true host of the dinner party. Every time someone asks me the hypothetical question, if you could have dinner with one person from history, who would it be? They always expect me to answer Jesus. But I never, ever will. Jesus was a dreadful dinner guest. He had horrible table manners and extremely poor etiquette. He was rude and disruptive and insulting. He often brought a +1 with him who was not invited. And he was terrible at small talk, always bringing up topics considered impolite for dinner conversation like sex and religion and politics. Worst of all, he told confusing riddles that didn't seem to have a point and spouted off grand hyperbolic proclamations and made onerous demands of both the hosts and the guests. So, like Jesus, I think I'd rather have dinner with the tax collectors and the sinners. So let me know when you want me to come over. When we think about sin today, we tend to generalize, imagining that everyone is a sinner or that no one is a sinner. But that is very different from what sin meant in the first century. In Jesus' day, sin was not a personal and spiritual malady that everyone suffered from, but a social and economic concept. Our American taboos of all things sexual lead us to try to pick on all the sex workers in the text, but the people in the Gospels who are listed most often with sinners are tax collectors and sinners. That is the common refrain in the Gospel. Marcus Borg once said that we should replace the word sinner in all the Gospels with the word outcast, because the word sinner referred to a social grouping of people who felt totally and wholly unacceptable, disgraceful, shameful. And Jesus' strategy for dealing with social shame was simple. He went and ate with those people. And by eating with outcasts, Jesus freed them from the shame and disgrace that society had put on them and rendered them socially acceptable and beloved. As poet Galway Kinnell writes, sometimes it is necessary to reteach a thing its loveliness, to put a hand on its brow of the flower and retell it in words and in touch. It is lovely, until it flowers again from within with self-blessing. That is how divine love works. It's like Theologian Belden Lane said, "Divine love is incessantly restless until it turns all woundedness into health, all deformity into beauty, all embarrassment into laughter." But there's one important thing we must remember about Jesus' love for the outcasts. Not all outcasts were poor. Many outcasts were quite wealthy. Tax collectors certainly weren't poor, and yet they were outcasts. We never get a clear definition of sinners in the Gospels, and most scholars are puzzled by what to make of the term. There's some discussion about the socioeconomic status of sinners in the first century in Jewish literature, but in those writings, sinners are almost always perceived to be the rich and the oppressive, not the poor. Biblical passages like Proverbs link sinners with violence and exploitation, immoral conduct that contradicted Jewish law or widely shared religious views. Sinner was a very broad term, so this woman from the city could have been a lot of things. She could have been a person who broke Jewish law or was married to someone who did. She could have been an adulteress or married to one. She could have been a Gentile or someone who associated or had contact with Gentiles. She could have been a wealthy landowner, a creditor, the wife of someone with a dishonorable occupation. All we know is she wasn't poor. The alabaster jar of ointment she used to put on Jesus' feet was worth about 300 denarii, the equivalent about $54,000. She could have bought Jesus a car with that money. Even a nice car, right? In fact, it's quite plausible that Jesus was financially indebted to this woman. She most likely was, or at least later became, one of the well-to-do women who are mentioned in the very next verses in Luke. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward, Chuza, Susanna, and it says many others who are not named, who Luke tells us accompanied Jesus and the disciples and provided for his ministry out of their own resources. She may have been one of the wealthy women who bought into, literally, and was bankrolling Jesus' mission. And what was the mission of Jesus? He was eating at a tax collector's house, a tax collector named Levi, when the Pharisees and scribes complained, "Why do you eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus answered, "I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners." And Jesus answered, "That way because that's who he came for." We tend to associate sin with poverty. That's on us. That's not in the text. Sinners in the gospel are the tax collectors and the creditors, wealthy landowners and the rich, exploiters of the poor. In the first century, the primary reason that people were in slavery was due to the practice of something called debt bondage, which required the poor to remain captive and work for free until they paid off their debts. And when Jesus preached his first sermon in Nazareth, quoting from Isaiah 61, as his mission statement, he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and proclaim the year of the Jubilee." He was not talking about the spiritually poor or captive or enslaved or oppressed. The Greek word for release that Jesus used specifically referred to the release of economic obligations, the forgiveness of monetary debt. Michael Hudson, a scholar whom many consider to be the most important economic historian of the last century, has recently written a book entitled "And Forgive Them Their Debts," where he claims Jesus expanded the Jewish tradition of Jubilee from Leviticus, where debts were forgiven every 50 years, into a radical economic agenda to redeem the poor from debt bondage. And Hudson claims that Jesus treated debt bondage literally, not just as a metaphor for spiritual bondage, and preached the redemption of all from financial debt. This is why the original Greek in the Lord's Prayer is not "forgive us our trespasses" or sins, as we often hear, but "forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." That was not a metaphor. Jesus admonished his followers in Luke 6 to lend to others without ever expecting to be repaid. A command which will likely give heartburn to all the bankers in our church. In Jesus' estimation, the ultimate test of a well-to-do person's goodness or righteousness was to relinquish financial power over their debtors by canceling their debts. Hudson also shows that in almost every ancient and modern language, the words for debt and sin are the same. No distinction is there between the moral and the economic. The economic was the moral, and the moral was the economic. Sin and debt. Sin was a debt owed to God and neighbor, but likewise debt often resulted of sins, fines imposed from harming another person or the community. And the highest sin, according to Jesus, was holding people in bondage to their financial debts. In first century, just like our century, debt was literally tearing people apart from one another. Pharisees like Simon were making things worse by cozying up with the creditors to create something called the prosobol clause. They put this clause in loans, which stated that debts were to be paid and could not be remitted even if the Jubilee year took place. They found a way around God's law with this clause. Jesus didn't appreciate it and came to liberate people from the dangerous system of economic disparity and hostility that existed between the creditors and the debtors. But he didn't start by rousing the debtors to armed revolution against the creditors. And he didn't go to the debtors to teach them how to manage their money, avoid bad debt, and practice sound investing like a first century Dave Ramsey. No, he started with the creditors. And he called them to forgive the financial debts of the poor. Forgiveness of debt was not just good news for the poor, it was the best news they could ever receive. It meant physical liberation from the chains of debt slavery. But it could also be good news for the creditors as well. By forgiving debts, that would have the power to reconcile relationships between them and the debtors, making peace between rich and poor and creating an entirely new community and economy that Jesus called the kingdom of God, where the last are first and the least are greatest. Jesus came to redeem people from their economic debt and reconcile rich and poor, to seek the release of all people from financial debt, to free people from slavery, to bring together the classes in society once and for all. And when Jesus said to Simon, "Therefore I tell you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven," he wasn't talking about her sexual sins. He was likely talking about her economic sins as one of the urban elite from the city, a member of the creditor class. And why was she forgiven? Because she showed such great love to Jesus. And what was so great about her love? Was it the tears or the hair or the kisses or the ointment? No, it was her generosity and hospitality to the poor, her forgiveness of Jesus. It was the way she lavished an expensive gift of love on someone who may have owed her a great financial debt. Jesus said, "Whatever you have done to the least of these, you have done to me," which also means that whatever you have done to Jesus is done to the least of these. She spent over $50,000 of wealth, humbly and extravagantly anointing the feet of a poor prophet who came to bring good news to the poor. The great love she showed was economic in nature, because if sin is economic, then love must be economic as well. Our society today is riddled with economic disparity. The gap between rich and poor in America is not only the largest in U.S. history, but the largest disparity of any advanced empire in human history. Student loan debt is ballooning, weighing a generation down. Predatory lending continues to be on the rise. Debt is literally tearing our society apart. And yet, we continue to insist on the sanctity of debt, that it must be paid, that it can never be forgiven. But while we insist on the sanctity of debt, Jesus is insisting on the sanctity of love, and forgiveness. Not sentimental or spiritualized love, but real, material, economic love. Love that is extravagant. Love that cancels debts. Love that offers forgiveness. Love that is a verb. Love that is an action. Love that does not require repayment. Love that keeps no record of wrongs. Love that is noble, selfless, unconditional, steadfast, and divine. When we read backwards that a creditor had two debtors, and when they could not pay, he canceled the debts for both, we should hear Jesus saying, this is what forgiveness and faith and love look like. When we read backwards that a rich woman from the city brought an alabaster jar of ointment, stood behind a poor man weeping, and began to bathe his feet with her tears and dry them with her hair, kissing his feet and anointing them with ointment, we should hear Jesus saying, this is what forgiveness, faith, and love look like. It is a love that is always both moral and economic, material and spiritual, personal and social. It is a love that has the power to release people from every kind of bondage, including financial bondage. It is a love that has the power to reconcile creditors and debtors, rich and poor. It is a love that has the power to literally heal the world and create a whole new community of justice, equity, and peace. I know what I've said today may sound scandalous and jarring, but that is the nature of love, is it not? It has the power to jar us wide open if we let it. It even has the power to save us all.